pain is usually treated as an interruption, an error, something that went wrong along the way. From an early age, we are taught to avoid it, suppress it, medicate it, or reframe it into something more palatable. Pain is labeled as weakness, misfortune, or failure. Yet this interpretation misses its deeper psychological function. Pain is not an accident on the path. It is the gate that appears precisely when a person is approaching a necessary transformation. When life moves smoothly, the psyche remains largely unconscious. Habits run on autopilot. Identity feels stable. Beliefs go unquestioned. Comfort creates continuity, and continuity creates sleep. Pain arrives when that sleep can no longer be maintained. It interrupts the familiar not to destroy it arbitrarily, but to reveal that what once worked has reached its limit. The intensity of pain is proportional to the importance of what is trying to change. At a deeper level, pain emerges when inner contradictions can no longer be ignored. Values no longer align with actions. Desires conflict with duties. The persona shown to the world drifts too far from the truth within. This tension builds quietly for years, sometimes decades, until the psyche can no longer compensate. When that compensation collapses, pain floods in. Anxiety, despair, emptiness, and loneliness are not the enemy here. They are signals that the inner structure is under strain. Most people experience this moment and immediately search for escape. They distract themselves, seek validation, cling to routines, or numb their awareness. They treat pain as a sign to retreat. But retreat only preserves the very structure that produced the suffering. The gate remains closed, and the pressure returns later, often stronger. Pain does not dissolve through avoidance, it deepens. Pain functions as a threshold because it forces consciousness inward. It strips away distractions and exposes the raw material of the self. In pain, illusions weaken. Narratives that once protected the ego begin to crack. The individual is confronted with questions that can no longer be postponed. Who am I without these roles? What have I been avoiding? What part of me has been silenced to maintain stability? These questions are destabilizing because they demand responsibility rather than comfort. Crossing this gate requires a willingness to remain present with discomfort without immediately resolving it. This is not passive suffering, but conscious endurance. To endure pain consciously is to listen rather than react. It is to allow the feeling to reveal its message instead of rushing to anesthetize it. In this state, pain becomes informative. It points directly to what has been neglected, denied, or over-identified with. There is also a loss embedded in this process. Pain marks the beginning of psychological death. Old identities, outdated beliefs, and false attachments begin to dissolve. This dissolution feels like grief because something familiar is being relinquished, even if it was limiting. The psyche resists this loss not because it is harmful to change, but because continuity feels safer than truth. Pain intensifies at the exact point where the old self refuses to let go. This is why the gate feels threatening. It demands the sacrifice of certainty. It asks for humility in the face of the unknown. On the other side of pain lies not immediate relief, but a reorganization of the inner world. Values shift. Boundaries change. What once felt essential loses its grip, and what was ignored gains weight. The individual becomes less concerned with external approval and more oriented toward internal coherence. Pain also isolates. It separates a person from collective distractions and shallow reassurance. This isolation is not meant to punish, but to differentiate. It creates the psychological space necessary for self-confrontation. Without solitude, the voice of the deeper self remains drowned out by noise. Pain reduces that noise until only what matters remains audible. Those who pass through the gate do not emerge untouched. They become less fragmented, less reactive, and less dependent on external validation. They understand that pain was not a mistake, but a demand for integration. What was once feared becomes a reference point for strength and clarity. The gate does not remove pain from life, it changes the relationship to it. Pain becomes a signal rather than a sentence, a guide rather than an enemy. To stand at this gate is to face the most decisive moment of psychological development. Nothing external can carry a person through it. No authority can bypass it. It must be crossed inwardly through attention, honesty, and endurance. Pain does not ask to be defeated. It asks to be entered, understood, and integrated. There is a point in psychological development where progress no longer feels like improvement. The familiar rewards disappear, motivation collapses, and what once provided direction begins to feel hollow. This is the threshold. It is not marked by external failure, but by internal tension. The old way of being still functions well enough to survive, yet no longer well enough to feel alive. This is where most people turn back. The threshold appears when a person is required to confront themselves without distraction. Earlier stages of life allow for imitation, adaptation, and compliance. One can follow inherited values, social expectations, and collective definitions of success without much resistance. These structures provide stability and belonging. Over time, however, the psyche begins to register a growing dissonance. The life being lived no longer matches the life being felt. The threshold emerges at the moment this mismatch becomes undeniable. At this point, anxiety increases, not because something is wrong externally, but because the internal framework is being questioned. The mind senses that continuing forward will require the dismantling of familiar identities. Roles that once provided security start to feel restrictive. Beliefs that once offered meaning lose their emotional charge. This produces fear, not of pain itself, but of uncertainty. The known, even when unsatisfying, feels safer than the unknown. Most people respond to this fear by retreating. They reinterpret the discomfort as a sign to restore normalcy. They double down on routine, seek distraction, or adopt borrowed narratives that explain the pain away. Some label it burnout, others call it bad luck or external stress. These explanations provide temporary relief because they absolve the individual of responsibility. The deeper call remains unanswered. Turning back does not always look dramatic. It often appears as subtle self-betrayal. One compromises a value to maintain belonging. One silences an inner conflict to preserve peace. One chooses predictability over truth. Each compromise reduces tension in the short term, but increases fragmentation over time. The psyche remembers what was avoided, and the cost of avoidance accumulates quietly. The threshold is difficult because it offers no clear reward. There is no promise of happiness or success waiting on the other side. What it offers instead is confrontation. To move forward requires examining unconscious patterns, inherited fears, and unintegrated aspects of the self. This process destabilizes the ego, which prefers coherence over truth. The ego would rather maintain a consistent narrative than face contradiction. Another reason people turn back is the loss of external validation. At the threshold, collective norms no longer provide guidance. Friends, family, and society often encourage a return to stability. They may not understand the internal necessity driving the change. Their concern reinforces doubt, making the individual question their own perception. Without inner authority, the pressure to conform becomes overwhelming. Crossing the threshold demands solitude, patience, and tolerance for ambiguity. These qualities are rare because they are uncomfortable. Modern life rewards speed, clarity, and constant reassurance. The threshold offers none of these. It slows everything down. It replaces answers with questions. It removes the familiar markers of progress. Many interpret this as regression rather than transition. There is also grief at the threshold. Moving forward means accepting that certain versions of the self cannot be carried along. Dreams formed under old assumptions must be released. Relationships based on outdated roles may change or dissolve. This loss feels personal, even when it is necessary. The pain of letting go often feels greater than the pain of staying the same, at least in the short term. Those who turn back often convince themselves that they made a mature decision. They frame retreat as practicality, responsibility, or realism. These justifications protect the ego from shame. Yet something vital remains unresolved. Over time, this unresolved tension may resurface as chronic dissatisfaction, cynicism, or quiet despair. The threshold does not disappear simply because it was avoided. Those who remain at the threshold long enough begin to notice a shift. The fear does not vanish, but it changes quality. It becomes less paralyzing and more instructive. Insight emerges slowly, often through discomfort rather than clarity. What once felt like chaos begins to reveal an underlying pattern. The individual starts to sense that the instability itself is a form of guidance. The threshold is not a test of intelligence or willpower. It is a test of honesty. It asks whether a person is willing to see themselves without the protective filters of habit and expectation. Most people turn back because this level of self-confrontation threatens the image they have carefully constructed. To proceed requires the humility to admit that the old identity is incomplete and the courage to step forward without guarantees. Pain is often interpreted as a sign that something has gone wrong. When discomfort appears, the immediate assumption is failure, a wrong decision, a lack of discipline, a personal weakness. This interpretation is deeply ingrained and socially reinforced. Success is expected to feel smooth, confident, and affirming. Pain disrupts that narrative, so it is treated as proof that one is falling behind. Yet psychologically, pain often signals the opposite. It emerges when growth has begun but has not yet stabilized. Growth is not a linear expansion of comfort. It is a restructuring process. When a person outgrows an internal framework, the psyche must reorganize itself. Old beliefs, habits, and identities that once provided coherence begin to lose their effectiveness. This loss of effectiveness creates friction. Pain arises in that friction, not because growth is failing, but because it is underway. The psyche is adjusting to a larger, more complex reality than it was previously able to hold. Pain becomes especially intense when growth challenges identity. Identity is not just a self-description, it is a survival strategy. It dictates how one relates to others, makes decisions, and interprets experience. When growth demands a shift in identity, the mind resists. The resistance is experienced as anxiety, confusion, or emptiness. These states feel threatening because they undermine certainty. The mind would rather maintain a flawed identity than risk having none at all. Many people misinterpret this stage as regression. They compare their current discomfort to earlier periods of stability and conclude that something has gone wrong. In reality, stability often precedes stagnation. A stable structure can only support a certain level of complexity. When inner development exceeds that limit, the structure must change. Pain signals that the old structure is being dismantled to make room for something more fitting. There is also a moral dimension to this misunderstanding. Pain is often associated with weakness or inadequacy. This association creates shame, which compounds the suffering. Instead of recognizing pain as a developmental signal, individuals turn against themselves. They attempt to force clarity, productivity, or positivity prematurely. This internal pressure intensifies the pain because it fights the very process that needs time and patience. Growth involves confronting aspects of the self that were previously avoided or suppressed. These aspects do not emerge gently. They surface through discomfort because they disrupt the existing self-image. Emotions that were once numbed become vivid. Conflicts that were ignored become unavoidable. This surfacing is painful because it exposes internal contradictions. Yet without exposure, integration is impossible. Pain marks the moment when awareness expands to include what was once excluded. Another reason pain accompanies growth is the loss of external validation. As individuals grow, they often move away from collective norms and expectations. What once earned approval may no longer feel authentic. This shift can lead to isolation or misunderstanding. The absence of reinforcement creates doubt, making growth feel like failure. The psyche, accustomed to feedback from others, struggles to rely on internal criteria. Pain arises in this transition from external to internal authority. Pain also reflects increased sensitivity. Growth does not numb, it refines perception. As awareness deepens, subtleties that were once overlooked become noticeable. Injustice, inconsistency, and misalignment register more strongly. This heightened sensitivity can feel overwhelming at first. It is not a breakdown, but an expansion of perception that has not yet been integrated into stable orientation. Avoiding pain at this stage often results in stagnation. When growth is interrupted, the psyche may revert to familiar patterns, but these patterns no longer fit. The result is chronic dissatisfaction rather than acute pain. Acute pain, though intense, is usually transitional. It signals movement. Chronic numbness or cynicism often signals avoidance. Understanding pain as evidence of growth changes the relationship to it. Instead of asking how to eliminate the pain, the question becomes what the pain is pointing toward. This shift does not remove discomfort, but it reduces self-blame. It allows patience to replace urgency. Growth unfolds in cycles of disruption and reorganization. Pain marks the disruption phase where old forms dissolve before new ones can stabilize. Those who can tolerate this phase without collapsing into self-judgment develop resilience and depth. They learn that pain does not define their worth or competence. It reflects the psyche's effort to evolve beyond previous limits. Over time, the pain diminishes not because it was fought, but because the new structure becomes strong enough to contain the expanded self. The experience leaves behind a quieter confidence rooted not in ease, but in understanding. Comfort is often mistaken for safety. It provides predictability, familiarity, and a sense of control. From the outside, a comfortable life appears stable and successful. Internally, however, comfort can function as a subtle form of stagnation. It preserves patterns long after they have fulfilled their purpose. What once protected the self can gradually prevent it from evolving. The psyche forms structures early in life to adapt to its environment. Beliefs, habits, emotional responses, and roles develop as strategies for survival and belonging. These structures are not mistakes, they are necessary. They allow the individual to function within family systems, cultures, and social expectations. Over time, however, these same structures can become rigid. Comfort reinforces them by reducing the pressure to change. As long as the environment remains manageable, the psyche has little incentive to question itself. Comfort dulls awareness. When life feels predictable, attention turns outward toward maintenance rather than inward toward reflection. The individual becomes identified with routines and roles that provide reassurance. This identification creates a stable sense of self, but it is often borrowed rather than discovered. The self that emerges under comfort is shaped more by adaptation than by authenticity. Outgrowing the self requires tension. Growth demands friction between who one is and who one is becoming. Comfort eliminates that friction. It smooths over dissatisfaction and offers distractions that prevent deeper inquiry. Subtle discontent is explained away or normalized. The psyche learns to tolerate misalignment as long as external stability is preserved. This tolerance gradually erodes vitality. One of the most deceptive aspects of comfort is its ability to mimic fulfillment. Pleasure, convenience, and routine can create a sense of completeness. Yet this completeness is static. It lacks the dynamic quality of growth. Over time, the absence of challenge leads to boredom, irritability, or quiet resentment. These signals are often ignored because comfort still appears preferable to uncertainty. Comfort also reinforces outdated identities. A person may continue to define themselves by roles that once provided meaning but no longer reflect their inner reality. These roles persist because they are rewarded socially. Letting go of them would disrupt relationships and expectations. Comfort encourages the maintenance of these identities even when they feel hollow. The cost of disruption appears too high compared to the discomfort of staying the same. Psychologically, comfort strengthens the ego's attachment to continuity. The ego prefers consistency over truth. It would rather preserve a coherent narrative than risk fragmentation. Comfort supports this preference by minimizing experiences that challenge the narrative. When contradictions arise, they are suppressed or rationalized. Growth requires confronting these contradictions, but comfort offers endless ways to avoid them. The longer comfort is maintained beyond its usefulness, the more intense the eventual disruption becomes. What could have been a gradual adjustment turns into a crisis. The psyche, denied smaller opportunities for change, eventually creates larger ones. Anxiety, depression, or sudden dissatisfaction often emerge not as random problems, but as signals that comfort has become constricting. Outgrowing the self means relinquishing familiar reference points. It involves questioning assumptions that once felt unquestionable. This process destabilizes the sense of identity because it removes the scaffolding that supported it. A comfort delays this destabilization, but it cannot prevent it indefinitely. The self that is meant to be outgrown remains latent, pressing for expression. Choosing growth over comfort requires a shift in values. Stability is no longer the primary goal. Alignment becomes more important. This does not mean seeking suffering for its own sake, but accepting discomfort as part of development. Discomfort reveals limits. It exposes areas where adaptation has replaced authenticity. Without this exposure, transformation remains superficial. When comfort loosens its grip, awareness sharpens. Emotions become more vivid. Questions become unavoidable. The individual begins to sense the difference between what feels easy and what feels true. This distinction is unsettling because truth often demands sacrifice, comfort offers reassurance, while truth demands responsibility. The self that emerges through growth is not necessarily happier, but it is more integrated. It operates with greater internal coherence. Decisions are guided less by fear of disruption and more by an understanding of inner necessity. This self cannot fully emerge as long as comfort dominates. Comfort preserves the familiar self even when that self has already served its purpose. There is a specific kind of pain that signals more than distress. It is not tied to a single event or external loss, but to an internal pressure that feels constant and unavoidable. This pain is disorienting because it does not respond to simple solutions. Rest does not resolve it. Distraction only postpones it. Advice feels inadequate. When pain reaches this intensity, it is often interpreted as a sign of collapse. Psychologically, it more often marks the edge of transformation. Transformation does not begin with clarity. It begins with destabilization. The inner structures that once organized life start to fail. Beliefs lose their authority. Motivations weaken. Goals that once provided direction no longer carry emotional weight. This collapse creates confusion because the psyche is accustomed to operating within known parameters. When those parameters dissolve, pain emerges as the mind searches for something stable to hold on to. The intensity of this pain reflects the depth of what is being challenged. Superficial changes produce manageable discomfort. Deep transformation threatens identity. Identity is the framework through which experience is interpreted. When that framework begins to fracture, the mind experiences it as danger. The pain is not a reaction to loss alone, but to the uncertainty of not knowing who one is becoming. At this edge, the old self is no longer functional, but the new self has not yet formed. This between state feels intolerable because it offers no solid ground. The psyche oscillates between clinging to what no longer fits and fearing what has not yet taken shape. Pain intensifies in this liminal space because there is nowhere to retreat without increasing inner conflict. Many people attempt to escape this edge by forcing resolution. They rush to redefine themselves, adopt new beliefs, or make drastic external changes. These attempts often fail because they bypass the necessary internal reorganization. Transformation cannot be rushed without becoming brittle. The pain persists when change is superficial because the deeper structures remain unexamined. This stage often brings heightened awareness of inner contradictions. Desires conflict with obligations. Values clash with behaviors. Long ignored emotions demand attention. These contradictions were always present, but they were held together by compensations that are now failing. Pain arises as these compensations collapse, exposing the underlying tension. There is also a sense of isolation at the edge of transformation. Others may not recognize what is happening or may minimize the experience. External reassurance feels hollow because the problem is not external. This isolation can deepen the pain, but it also serves a function. It withdraws energy from collective expectations and redirects it inward. Without this withdrawal, the transformation remains incomplete. Pain at this stage is not meant to be eliminated immediately. It is meant to be understood. Each surge of discomfort carries information about what is being resisted. Fear points to attachment. Grief reveals what is being released. Anxiety signals the absence of a familiar orientation. When these signals are met with attention rather than avoidance, they begin to organize themselves into insight. Standing at the edge requires endurance rather than action. This is difficult because action provides the illusion of control. Endurance requires trust in a process that cannot be fully seen. The psyche must be allowed to disassemble and reassemble itself in its own time. Pain intensifies when this process is interrupted by premature conclusions. Transformation reshapes perception. What once seemed important loses urgency. What was ignored gains significance. Relationships, ambitions, and values are re-evaluated. This re-evaluation is painful because it disrupts continuity. Yet without disruption, growth remains constrained by outdated priorities. The edge of transformation is not a guarantee of a better life in conventional terms. It is a demand for greater internal coherence. The psyche seeks alignment between inner truth and outer life. Pain arises where misalignment has become unsustainable. The more entrenched the misalignment, the sharper the pain. Those who remain at this edge without fleeing gradually notice a shift. The pain does not vanish, but it becomes less chaotic. Patterns emerge. Insight accumulates. The psyche begins to form a new center of gravity. This new orientation is quieter and less dependent on external validation. It does not eliminate uncertainty, but it can tolerate it without disintegration. If it hurts this much, it is because something fundamental is being reorganized. The pain marks the boundary between what has been and what must become. To stand here is to face the cost of transformation directly. It is not a punishment for weakness, but the pressure required to reshape a structure that has reached its limit